Hello, welcome back to another episode of our Mega-lo-Mania in Unreal Engine. Before I start proper, I am just going to try and get the levels of some background music correct. So, just waiting for my viewer. So will be a few minutes more. Just waiting for Twitch to update. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the background music. I've added a panel onto the channel. Hopefully that's visible for what this is and where it's from. But it's just a Spotify playlist from NCS, which is no copyright, whatever they called it, no copyright sounds. So should be audible now. Nope, didn't add the panel because I didn't save it, apparently. Oh no, we did save it. It's at the top, I think. Yeah, at the top. Just trying to get the volume level right of the background music. Where are we? One. So I'll get into what has changed. Still may need to adjust that, but hopefully that's okay. So since Wednesday, so I did some more work on it on Thursday as time allowed. Just general improvements mostly. Well, that's what I thought. So originally this this new sector, this test sector that we've been working on, had child actors, or what were they called? Child actor components. And the child actor components were quite neat. They worked quite well in terms of showing the images of the buildings, and the parent and the child effectively could communicate nicely with each other as well. So I thought that that was quite good. But the issue with the way that it was before was that it didn't allow the buildings to be built or be destroyed, and that kind of meant that I would have to either not use it all or work around to some extent the engine's native damage applying factors, and I felt that perhaps not having the building there would make things easier in terms of handling the building not being available for that sector yet. So I tried a few things yesterday, and eventually came to the conclusion, or the solution, that the children can be attached, or I suppose they're not really children in that sense, other actors can be attached to each other. I'm not really 100% certain under what circumstances you would do that. I saw bits and pieces about perhaps doing it for equipment on characters, things like that. It would make some sense for. But as I say, it's difficult with all the ways that you can do something in this engine and other engines like it to really know under what circumstances a particular feature was designed for. Even though they're not often quite flexible, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work well if you don't use it in the way that it was intended to be used, at least moving forwards. Nonetheless, I felt that that was true definitely with the child actors, the child actor components. I felt that they, in the way that I wanted to use them, it wasn't really the way that they were best suited for. And because you can't dynamically add child actor components, or effectively it doesn't look like they really support dynamic addition of components to actors at all. It did eliminate the being able to create and destroy those additional buildings. So I have instead created the buildings are still the same blueprints as they were before, they're modified for the new functionality, but so the buildings themselves are still there, and in the sector I've added this, where did I add it? Constructed building event, nope, not that one. Yeah, sorry, I haven't actually done the building of a building as such. In the level, oops, that one, I added a load of additional inputs. I think I'm looking at the wrong level, aren't I? Let's try again. Is that better? That's more like what I was expecting. So I've added some additional inputs for different characters of the keyboard, and they effectively just map up to certain things. So we've got S, which spawns me a sector, C for castle, M for mine, etc. We have tech, or T for advanced the tech level of a random sector, and we have P, which is possess a random sector. So if we just play it now, again we've got 2 players, and by default there's absolutely nothing in the world. So if I press S, there spawns a sector, because I moved it around. You have to find that sector. There we go. So that sector, we can move to it. Oh, but if we press S again, we spawn another one. I tried to move backwards, so it spawned another one. So obviously the key bindings that I've got are just purely for testing anyway. So now I've got 2. I can press P to possess one, and we can see that the camera kind of locks into place next to that. Sorry. Takes the camera and actually possesses the camera of the pawn, which we'll look at in a few moments. But that gives us the right angle and distance that we want from the sector, more or less. It's still to be tweaked a little bit. If I press P again, in this case player 2 has now possessed the first sector, and by doing that it kicks out the first player, so the first player is now kind of back looking at nothing. So if I press P enough, I can get it so they're both looking at 2 different sectors. Now if I press C, it spawns a castle. In this case it spawned a castle onto the second sector, and it spawned that castle at a random tech level, because if I press T it changes the tech level of the sectors at random. Now obviously it also changes the one on player 1 that doesn't have any buildings, so we can't see it happen, but on player 2 we can see when it happens. There's no check to verify if there's buildings already existing on a particular sector, so if I press C, we might be building multiple castles on both sectors really. But now they both have castles, so I can flip through all the tech levels and we can see the castle changes, and you can see just on the far left of the second player we can see that the castle shadow effectively changes when it should change for the different tech levels. There we go, we can see it just changed there. We can also build the mine. We can build the mine in both places, and we can definitely see that one. And then we can iterate over the tech levels again, and we can see the mine disappears when the tech level doesn't support a mine, and reappears when it does, including the pit mining hole. So that's basically what I worked on yesterday to get this to work. And there's some complications, and the biggest complication I think was perhaps kind of balance between expectation and it just not working that way. And it comes in with the construction script that effectively I was trying to use in context where there isn't actually any information. So a building is spawned with kind of no information as it stands, and it actually gets whether it gets its parent, which is the sector, by either the owner of the building or the attached parent actor of the building, and we'll look at that in a minute. But when the sector is spawned, the sector is spawned with a random tech level, a random epoch level. So if we go to our level blueprint again, over here, we can see that when I press S, we spawn a sector, and we use this macro that I created of get random epoch, and we pass that straight in. And the issue that I was doing was that in the construction script, the epoch isn't set under specific circumstances. So we can print this epoch out. We'll leave it turquoise, put it for some seconds. So if I press S now, we can see that the server says 100 BC and the client says 9500 BC. We'll do it again, and we spawn another one, and the server and the client still disagree. And the reason they disagree is because within the construction script, it's using the default epoch, which is currently set to 19500. And the issue that it's kind of obvious now that I know it and now that I've had to work through it, but the property is meant to be replicated, as is the case, and it is replicated, just not before the construction script is called. So if we actually take this debug effective statement out of here and put it into the event begin play instead, we actually get one already, but we'll just print it to the screen, so we don't need that one. And we compile and run it again. So now when I press S, we can see that the client and the server state the same thing, and that's consistent. So at the event begin play event, the data has been propagated and replicated correctly, and I think that was an issue that I was facing in previous iterations or previous tests that I've been doing. The construction script is too soon, and I was effectively using it incorrectly. So another complication I had was that when I spawn a sector, when I spawn a building in a sector, this code just picks a random sector by getting all the sectors, shuffling it, and picking the first one. And then I spawn the appropriate building, and once it's spawned, I do attach to actor, and that takes a reference to the sector itself and attaches it to the new building or attaches the new building to the sector. It's a bit awkward with its child and parent actor, but that's just the terminology they've used. So that's what that does. And now they're connected, they can communicate, they can get references to each other, they can check that they exist, that kind of thing, which is important when it comes to building the sectors. The problem is, again, with the replication, so far as I can tell, and I am just going to put some additional text in or print statements in to verify my assumption here, but what I believe to be the case was that the owner is set on the spawn. Where is the spawn? Here. And it's set to this random sector I'm spawning it to. So the owner should be guaranteed, but that's in that code there. And the parent attach owner is done just after it's spawned, which might be too late for the event begin play. So I'm going to do here, let's just try and print out some text just to see if the owner is ever not true. Golden does not have an owner. Now I may have just been putting this again in the construction script before I moved it here, and there's another error already here anyway, or it may be another replication issue. So we'll spawn the sector first and we'll possess it with one of the two characters, and we'll build a castle, and there was no errors there, neither for parent or child, or sorry, for player 1 or player 2. So we'll just run P until we get that, build another sector, there we go, and I'll just spawn castles until we get 2, and mines. We've also got the lab and the factory. There we go, and we'll just run through the text so we can see that they all show up. But one thing I did clearly notice was that at no time did we get any of the 2 errors. So perhaps this is more complicated than it needs to be. Perhaps there's no scenario in which the owner is not set. But there might be a scenario in which the parent isn't set. So I'm just going to wire this up the other way around. Go straight into there. On the is not valid for the parent actor, we'll come back over there and do what we did before, except we won't go into that bit. And So we'll just see if that produces any more errors. So spawn 2 sectors, possess them, spawn a castle. So we do have an error show up here. And the server is saying failed to attach the parent. Okay, so that does make some sense. That's kind of what I remember seeing. Now the reason that is that the event begin play of the actor is called before the attach. And there's no way to spawn and attach at the same time. You always have to do one after another. And evidently, on the server, this isn't a dedicated one, on a server, or the host, it's possible to spawn the actor and the begin play call before the attach is done. So you can't rely on the attach parent actor part. Even though that really is how I'd like to get the building's owner, effectively, or the sector the building belongs to, it doesn't appear that I need to because I'm setting the owner correctly anyway. So I'm going to just take out all this bit. So much so is that we'll just leave it like that. And from that we can see if we've run into any errors moving forwards. But this bottom branch isn't actually going to run anymore. Okay, so that's kind of a quick rundown of what I did, what I've changed. Hopefully the building stuff, in terms of kind of creating the building, I think that kind of covers it. It obviously doesn't cover any of the the process of making a building within the game environment, but at least the spawning stuff works. The tech part is done by the sector triggering an event called Advanced Tech Level. Again, that's the same one as we had before, and then that goes straight in a building that is listening to that event. It goes straight into the update building for Epoch, and effectively that's the same code as we had before. We've got all the paper sprite components for the building that have been populated based on the building with the appropriate sprites. So there's no change there. We do have to bind to the event though. That's the thing that I found was a little bit frustrating in comparison to the way that it was before. In the way that it was before, when they're child actor components, in this case when they're paper sprite components or whatever they happen to be, you can actually get the events directly straight from here. For example, we could do the on component hit for one of the tech level images, or maybe just the on clicked would be a good example. So we're on click on the very first tech level, and we can just do that, and then we can run, spawn a sector, possess it, display a castle, and just iterate through. I don't think I do click events, so that's not going to be a good example, but point is that you can create that event directly for anything that's in here. And when I had the sector, that worked. But now the sector, when the building was a child of the sector, sorry, it worked. Now that the sector is set as a component, that doesn't work by default. If I can select the variable, I can select the appropriate event that I want, and it creates this, but it never fires. The only way I could get it to fire was actually do the binding, and then obviously tie it to an event, custom event. So not great in that regard, because there may be quite a lot of sector-based events that have to be handled by the buildings and vice versa. So there's going to be a lot of these bindings all over the place, but for the time being, I'm happy with the fact that it works. So we had before a very crude UI, currently isn't being shown. It's done in the level blueprint, I believe. remember. No, sorry, it was the HUD was specified by the player, by the blueprints, wasn't it? So just got to check the right mode, sector test mode. That one. Game mode base here. So we set the game mode, so that should use our sector test sector HUD, and our test sector HUD creates a population widget and displays that. So our population widget, not the best one because it's actually going to be probably a bit more than that, but it is intended to show the castle population. So what we actually have now, because the pawn is still possessed, and I did forget to mention the camera, so in the viewport we can see that our sector now comes with its own camera, and that camera is pointing at the sector at appropriate distance. It's not set to 2D whatever it was, orthographic at the moment, just because that slightly changes how it looks at the sector, slightly changes position. So I'll deal with that some other time, but we've got that camera in there, and when there's a camera in here, I don't know what would happen if there were multiple cameras, but at least when there's only one camera, when I possess that actor or that pawn, effectively this pawn, sorry, not just the slate or slab, the actor becomes active, the camera becomes active, and that gives us that very quick movement between the different sectors. So we're always viewing the sector from the right place. Now my theory is that what we'll do is display or have all of the sectors in the world in the appropriate location to make the map in the right way. So in the first map they would be above and below each other. In the last map it would be a grid of them, but they'd be so far apart that each individual camera wouldn't be able to see one or the other. So in this case they're so close that we can see the end of one sector in this one, but I'd separate them up so that any one camera on any one sector can't see any other sector, and that way all the sectors can be visible to the person that they need to be, without causing any kind of overlap or awkwardness with showing the right thing or hiding them or that kind of stuff. So just all of them are visible to everybody, because inevitably only the information that the owner is allowed to have will be propagated or replicated to that player anyway, so it shouldn't make any difference. That's the theory anyway. So our widget gets the player pawn, which is the sector. Now before, the sector just had a castle already. Unfortunately it doesn't, but it does have what is it? Attached parent. Get attached actors. So we could obviously use this one to give us an array of actors, and then we could iterate over that array of actors, find which one is a castle, and then use that. But I think a better way would be within the script of the sector. It gets told when a building is constructed here, and it's only going to ever have 4 buildings, so it may as well have 4 variables that we will put into the category building. And they all will be replicated. I think that we can replicate them to the owner only, because only the owner is going to need to access the buildings from the sector. So we'll go with that. And this one, so we'll start at 0. This one is going to be the castle reference. Oh, not red. So I'll just call it reference just in case there's just in case there's a need to have another variable of castle or something like that. Line reference. It needs to be T-mine. I think I did this one as a castle. Should be T-castle. Factory. So one advantage is obviously that because we've named them and we've defined them explicitly as that type, we don't actually have to cast them later on either. Didn't know. There's a select class. Unfortunately, the select class is a class that's a bit limited because you can only do one or the other. That's limited too. So what we're actually getting in is a building. We don't know which building it is. In this particular event. So what would be the best way of dealing with that again? So the way the buildings are constructed with our key is that we just check if we've got authority, and then what we do is we call construct building on the level with a building class. And construct building then finds the appropriate actor. I think maybe this is being spawned at the level primarily because I feel that that's the right place to spawn it, but the way that the engine works is that it doesn't have to be done here. We could just spawn it in the sector itself once it finishes saving. Because we're going to call the function on the sector anyway, construct building. So we can go into this, give it a new function. What function do we call it? Oh, it's actually an event in this case. We'll do it as a function, I think. I'm not sure why that an event would be better in this case or not. So we want to spawn the actor. I wonder why that's gone all red. We'll just keep going, make sure that so actually we can. So So we can create a class reference. This isn't going to work because it's still too generic. It still doesn't know what kind of building it is. So that change isn't going to make any difference. Because we're kind of, rather than passing in the actual types, we're passing in a generic type. By the time it gets to the code where we have to assign it to our variables, it doesn't actually work. The obvious but not necessarily very elegant way of doing it is brute force, and effectively let's just cast the new actor to all the 4 different types, and then if we find the right one we'll set it. There might be a better way, cleaner way to do it later on, but I don't want to go through and change everything all over again or anything like that. So we'll basically say if we've successfully cast the actor to a castle, then do that. Otherwise, oh, I copied and pasted it, didn't I? That doesn't work. Cast to T-mine. So a little bit of a stairway code. Maybe a bit too close. This will actually work, and perhaps the overhead of the brute force cast isn't really going to affect the game too much because it's only going to do it once. Once per building per sector at worst. So that'll at least work. Defines all our references. We obviously have to account for when the actor's destroyed. We could do is so because we have to account for when the actor's destroyed, again we need to know which actor it is that we've destroyed. It starts getting a bit tedious then again. We can bind to its event of destroyed. I suppose what we could do is just to get this to work. That's not quite what we want. We'll fix this. So in this, what we're doing here is we've got a macro that will cast to building actor. That takes just one T building. take one building. There we go. And it'll output... I don't know if we need all the different lines. We don't need all the different lines, do we? Just join them all back up to the top. What we will have though is a failed one. Didn't account for that. Not that we should ever get a failed one given what we're going to put into it, but it's best just to have that tied up just in case. So this macro will brute force cast our new building until we know until we know a better way of doing it, or a better solution. Yeah, we don't want to do that because that's going to blank all the ones that we haven't set. Brute force casting is not the smartest. Do have to have all of the exits so that the code can follow the right path. Not too many there. So as untidy as it may be, it's going to be functional. We don't care about the failed. Don't know how to set the... Oh, maybe it's just not. Don't know how to set the things to none. But obviously that's what we want to do in this case. Maybe it's just like that. So we just ignore all the outputs there. It doesn't compile with any errors, so that may work. Yeah, so there's no real reason to have the building passed in as that. So we'll just pass in an actor reference instead, so that the destroy scenario will work. Because we're going to cast it anyway, so might as well, yeah, might as well do that. So, we don't actually have a method in place to destroy the castle yet, but it's likely going to happen sometime soon. So from the sector, we can now just get the castle ref variable and pass that straight in here. The castle should have a population still, that code still should be in place, although I don't think it increments, so we'll just tie that back up again. I'll leave it as just adding one to it. I think that's just easiest, even though that adds one quite quickly. Okay, so we get a load of spams because the player hasn't possessed a sector yet, so we can spawn our sector and we can possess our sector. And now we get some error because the sector castle isn't set correctly, which is all the code that we've just done in place. So we're hitting this. We don't need to cast it, apparently. It does make some sense. Maybe we're just casting it and again to the same thing, and that's where it was complaining about. Let's try that again. So again, the spam, so we create a sector, we possess it. Okay, that's not too bad. Our I think that shouldn't complain. Yes, so there's no complaints, but there's no population either, and I would expect this should be ticking away. Oh, sorry, yes, of course, there's no castle. The fact that it's not erroring, I would have thought it would have errored. Or maybe there is an error in the logs. Yes. There's an error in the log. Spam of errors in the logs. Okay, that's fine. No, nothing on screen, but lots of errors in the log. So we do need to do some checks. We can put those checks in place. We've already got a log to say the player hasn't got a pawn. This is our UI, and if the player doesn't have a pawn, nothing's going to work anyway. So I'll leave that just in case, for the time being at least. It can be removed later, but we don't necessarily need it because the UI shouldn't do anything if you don't have a pawn anyway. What we do want to know though is that the owner of the sector is the same as the player that's possessing it. I just realised there's another issue with that, isn't there? Oh, it's always something else. The issue that I have is that because the camera is attached to the sector, and as was evident, only one person can possess the same sector, that's not going to be true. It's entirely possible for two players to be looking at the same sector at the same time, so I can't have the camera inside the sectors. I have to have the camera separate. Or there has to be multiple cameras. And even if there are multiple cameras, they'd have to be on top of each other. Okay, so theirs both have auto activate on them. See if that makes, actually I don't know if auto activate causes any. Yeah, so the auto activate works. So now we go to here. No, we still can't possess it. I think that's the bottom line, is we can't. I need to figure out how that's going to work. It's like only the owner should be able to possess it. But other owners still need to be able to look at it. I think though, I've got within the level, the P key says basically pick a random sector and pick a random player. I can check that. Can I check? Yeah, so I'm going to have to deal with, I think I'm very keen on having the player that's interacting with the sector possessing it, because I think that makes it very easy from a UI perspective of what to do. But obviously the player can't possess the sector, or the player can't possess the sector unless it's theirs. That's kind of the only limitations here, since only one player can possess something at a given time. The possession also allows for the appropriate replication, although that's not going to be 100% true, because the player would need the data for the sectors that they haven't, or sorry, that they're not looking at. So there's a whole bunch of complication into trying getting this to work, so I have to review that and do some more changes. Nonetheless, we were looking at sector, possess. I'll actually turn that back to auto activate for the time being. Sector, possess, build a castle. So now we're getting that event. Yeah, so if we create another sector and create another castle, so now we have 2 castles, 2 sectors. Nicely enough, it created just 1 castle on both, so there's no awkwardness with having multiple castles, but in fairness that wouldn't make any difference. It's just going to reset that number. I think you can just see on the right hand side or the left, it goes down to 100 when it possesses. I'm not sure why it goes down to 1 and not, oh no, sorry, it starts at 100, so that's perfectly fine. So every time I press C and I create a new castle, it resets the reference that we've got within the sector to the new castle, so it resets the number back to 100. So there's a whole bunch of castles stacked on top of each other, and they're all using the same sprite in the same location, so it's not visually obvious. But point is that we can see that, and we'll just let the go a bit further. So now we can see the right hand side, player 1, so player 2 has over 1,000 population, and the left hand side has 300. If we possess, and now we've switched player 1 to the second place, we can see that the population, once I get it right, there we go, it's the same way it was, but population sticks with the castle and applies and is displayed by the user that's possessing it. Now obviously in a multiplayer game we don't want either player to look at either one. We've got to put the checks and bounds in there to make sure they're only possessing their own one. But the fact that they can switch and the information is separate all kind of points to the fact that some parts of it are at least going in the right direction. Now what do we do from here? Yeah, so no castle. I think that's what I needed to pick. So there's a scenario here where the sector is owned but has no castle. That's not actually going to be the case in the game. Depending on exactly how the sector viewing works, and the ownership and the possession. I think actually there is a scenario where the player would not have a castle. If they are trying to claim it, then they would have, it would be permitted for them to possess it but not have a castle on it. So I'll just route that up, and now we can spawn 2 sectors, possess them until both players have 1 each, and we are error free both in logs and on screen. So we've sorted that. Now in this scenario the UI would be showing the progress for building a castle, assuming that the other criteria are correct, and if it weren't they wouldn't possess it anyway, based on the logic that I've thought of so far. Accidentally close the output log, so get that back up. So within our UI, I'm going to just change the name for this, because it's not the population anymore, it's just the test sector widget. So we're currently showing the castle population. Put that in there. And we'll call that population. Call it population. Didn't want to give it a name. Text. So that shows our population. The next thing that we can show for a sector that's fairly straightforward is the tech level of it. Ooh, I changed it. Should have wrapped it, but nonetheless. That's right. So we drop down another horizontal box. So I don't intend to make this UI the same as the real game. It's really just going to be kind of a dump of all the information that the sector has, as much as is possible to fit anyway, and from that we can see that things are working correctly. Oops. So that needs to be a variable. So we don't want to do that to text, we want to do that to name, and then name to text. So probably have to kind of clean the order up a little bit. A bit later on. Otherwise this is going to go on forever. But now we should be able to create a sector and possess it. Not really sure what that text is, but it certainly needs to be a bit smaller font.
What do you think of this one?
Process. Numerator 0. Okay, it's not quite as of a nice name as I was expecting, to be fair. I did think that they, because we have, where did we print it out? We printed it out in the spawning of the sector. User-friendly name of enumerator. I did that. It should be toString, shouldn't it? That'll give us a user-friendly name that we wanted. Sector possess. There we go. So now we can iterate through the tech levels and we can actually see the tech level of the sector change. So just kind of building up this information. A sector should also have resources, and just predefine it with 2 resources. Data resources. So we'll have wood and we'll have the alien face as R2. But we can have more, but it would only ever be 4 anyway. So again, we'll go to our sector and we'll add another horizontal box. We don't need to add to this one a label, because it's literally just going to be 4 resources. I'm not really sure why our widgets have a pre-construct event and a post-construct event in this context, in the event graph, where actors have a construction script. Kind of seems like they should be about the same, but maybe that's a future enhancement that they'll make, or there's some reason why they didn't do it the same. So if you press Control and drag, it gives you a get. If you press Alt, it gives you a set. I was just trying to get the right keyboard shortcut there. So in this case, we'll just quickly make an array of all of our images so that we can reference them later. And we'll set that in the pre-construct. So this will be for some reason the category don't seem to work with variables defined from the designer. So this will be resource images. And then what we can do is, once we've confirmed, no we don't, this isn't a sector, this isn't a castle thing, this is a sector thing. So what we'll do actually, once we know it's a sector, we'll run a sequence. So this one's dealing with the sector and this one's dealing with effectively the castle, and we'll probably have some more sequences later on for our other buildings. So I'll just keep going this way for the sector. So we set the tech level. We then want to iterate over all of our resources. Now we only have 4 images, we're only ever really going to support 4, so there's no real reason to support more, even though it's really just to add more images. So what, rather than a 4 each over all the resources, I think I'll 4 each for range. Is that what we want? Just for loop. So the first index is 0, last index is 3, because it's inclusive. And from our sector, it's over here, we want to get our resources. Length. So the length is going to be 1 less than this loop needs to go through, I think. Yeah, because the length of this will be 2, but there's actually 0 and 1, so we just need to take one away. Very spaced out. So we do that to actually iterate over the right amount. Well, that doesn't make any sense, does it? If you're going to always iterate over the right amount, then we might as well have just done it the other way in the first place. Yeah. So we just want to get a quick check to make sure that we're not going to try and get something we shouldn't get. So I think just less than. Less than or equal to. That's true, we want to get it. That gives us a resource name. And from that we have to actually get our resource. And from that we have access to our sprite. We also want to get our resource images at the right index. And this is just the normal behavior of creating a sprite, creating a brush from a sprite and setting the brush, which is the new sprite. That's that. So that might display the right resources. So we create a sector, we possess it, another sector, and we'll just possess it until we get both of them. So the wood worked, our alien did not, but we also aren't getting any errors. So I think it's just probably that. Check here. We obviously are currently doing this every tick. When it comes to the resources, we probably don't want to be doing it every tick, but what we could do is have the widget cache some of the information, depending on kind of what's constructing what as it goes. But again, that's kind of optimization. Once we've got all the data there, if that is a problem point, or even later on just to optimize it, we can fix that. So because it's every tick, it does give us the ability to add a breakpoint, and I think that's probably because that's why it did it. When I connected the pin up and then took it away, it reset that value to 0. So we weren't iterating over all the resources. Create sector and possess it. Yeah, now we can see our little alien. Possess until both of them cover it. So we get rid of our errors. So we get our 2 resources. Again, it's not clean, but it's kind of just proving that the information is really quite accessible over what it was before. And we can later rather than have this information just displayed on the UI, we can start filtering on whether it's available. So in this case, the type indicates that it needs to be a pit or it needs to be a mine, and if the player doesn't have those, they shouldn't show up. So we could, I think, switch. Do we want to switch on name? Yeah. So the resources that we opened earlier, there's deep mine, open pit or surface. So again, this could be enums, which kind of said before, which would help with making sure everything's correct, because obviously the name doesn't have to be case matching, although I do maintain the case. It does have to match all the words. So we actually only want to render the sprite if the resource is available for this particular sector. Now if it's a surface, it's always available. It's open pit. There's many ways that we can determine whether it is, but the open pit one's fairly straightforward because the open pit is available from Tech 3 onwards. So we can take the epoch, we can say is it greater than, we can use a literal epoch value to get the one we want. So it should be BC, 100 BC. And if that's true, then again we want to show the brush. And finally, the third one actually requires the mine. So what we'll do with that is we'll do an is valid check. That one. And if it's valid, we'll draw the mine. We'll draw the brush. And the is valid part comes from whether the sector has a mine. So we can get mine reference, pass that in there. So, create two sectors, possess them until they're both possessed. There we go. We'll select the areas clear. So in this case, they're both sat on 300 BC. They both have the wood available. If we advance one of them, and then we build a mine, we can see on the left hand side we have the yes, that's wrong. That way round is wrong. So if the current epoch is greater than or equal to that one, we want to show that is feels right. Let's try that again. Sector. Okay. Yeah, so there isn't a pit by a mine by default. So while the player 1 has the right tech level, I do currently have to build the mine effectively for the deep pit to show up, or the open pit, sorry, to show up. So if I build the mine on both of them, we can actually see that the second resource shows up in both cases, which isn't what I would expect. the second resource shows up. Let's find out why. So we're looking at one's in 100 BC and the other one's in 1980 AD. So the 100 BC one, oh no, it's less than or equal to, yeah, so that's correct at the moment. So if I change the tech level, okay, so it's somewhat irritating, the tech level of the mine didn't change. And now it's working correctly. Maybe it was just because there was lots of mines over the top of each other. But the resources don't seem to go away as they should. Let's simplify it with a single player. So we'll create a sector and possess it. Ooh. Sector and possess it. Possessing it didn't work very well, but we'll build the castle and the mine and the lab and the factory. So now if we go through the tech, we can see they're all there. But we shouldn't be able to get the alien. So now we know we're on just the one sector. We can see that half the variables are not in scope, which doesn't help. So we're looking at the alien now anyway. Step over. Oh, nope. As I was aware, this is the event tick of the widget that we should only have one of. Annoyingly, half the variables are never in scope. Okay, we're on the wood then, so let's see what we're on now. Okay, we're on the alien again. Alien says that it is the deep mine, so if we step over, we should go down, and we don't. It says wood now. Do we ever get there? Yes. Yeah, okay, I see the problem. Because I build the mine, even though the mine isn't visible, the mine is still there. So that's always going to be true. If the mine was built and if the open pit and the mine weren't the same, or at least distinguishable, then it would be possible to do this correctly, or more correctly. But there's obviously some issues with just spawning the buildings. It has some basic functionality though in the way that it works, so it's still good enough to move forward with. So we can have our full resources. We'll put moonlight in there just so that we've got a third for the full type. And what else do we have? An onion. Again, just so that we've got the whole 4 in place. We'll have another one. The moron. Awkwardly named, but we'll have that one just so that we can see that the limitations work correctly. Yeah, so the 5th one effectively doesn't show up, but the ones that we were expecting do. So the size of the image is a bit big. I think they should just be 16 by 16. Just makes it take up a little less room. Okay, so what else is there? Obviously, there's quite a lot, but what else can we do? Still have the castle, population. So one thing that I did want to look at was actually spawning an army. It's obviously another big thing that there's lots of kind of unknowns. And it'd be good to try and address some of these unknown things early on. I can't remember what the default colour of the text was. So I'll just set it to black. So our button can be clicked. Should actually only need to do that. So at the moment we don't have any variables to work with, so we just have to get the possessed pawn again within this event and do the cast again to a sector. We also want the castle, which is done there, and to check that that's valid. I'm not going to put any errors here, it should be fairly obvious. We'll have errors caught in the previous case. So if you've got a castle, we want to get the population. Do we need to get the population? No, we don't. So I was going to go down the line of actually doing the creation of the army here, but obviously here in the widget isn't the right place because it's not on the server, or it may not be on the server. So under normal circumstances, the user would define the size of their army they want. In the original game, they kind of left click until they add to a pool of people. But we're just going to take this spawn army button and for it to spawn an army of a random size based on the population of the castle. So some of these checks perhaps aren't necessary depending on what other variables we have later on. The button won't be available unless the sector is possessed, and the button won't be available unless there's a castle on it because it can't be possessed without a castle. So that's all kind of semantics really. It's not gonna ever need that check. But we want to effectively trigger the creation of the army on the player, I think the player needs to do it. Blueprint. It's using the menu player controller, so I think now we need a new one for this. Player controller. Test player controller. So we set the player controller. Don't think the menu player controller did anything except for show the cursor, I think. So we'll just have a quick look. Show mouse cursor was the only thing that's changed, I think. Oh, I need to uncheck that one. That's fine. So we now got a test player controller. Okay, we don't need any of that because it's all coming through the UI anyway. Don't think it's action. So from the widget, we are going to go to the player controller, and from the player controller, we will do whatever needs to be done on the possessed actor. Rather than going from the widget to the sector directly, I think. I don't know if it matters. We'll go to the sector directly just because that means I have to do less stuff. So So inevitably we'll have to define the army types or the composition of the army. But again, we're just going to skip that. Do it from the casted one. See if this is in the right place. So hopefully when we press the button, so we'll create a sector, possess it, wait for our span to disappear, click the spawn button, nothing happens. Again, so we definitely come in here. Cast works okay. Maybe it's no other sector. Oh, of course we did that. Try again. Okay. We are where we want to be. So I'm thinking that an army will actually consist of multiple actors depending on how many people, how much of the population is in that army. But it all has to be controlled by one actor. Rather than all the individual actors, and the individual actors are just really for display purposes and animation purposes. They won't actually be involved in the combat. Only the parent actor would be. So we're going to create a new blueprint actor class. We're going to call this Army. We already have in our sprites our man blueprint from earlier, way earlier, kind of one of the first or second episodes. So what we're going to do, try and get this done quickly, is when this actor comes to life, it's going to spawn some actors, depending on how big it is. But what we'll do is just say let's do 10 for the time being, and that's going to be the man, and the owner is going to be this actor itself, but it's going to look after them. And the location make vector. Can just be 0, 0 for now. We'll have to figure out the proper location and bounds for this particular movement later on. So when this actor is created, when the army is created, it will create 10 men to run around. So this is actually only executed on the server. We only actually want one army blueprint, one army actor in existence for each actual army of the player. If the player moves 2 armies into the same sector, then those 2 armies need to join together to produce a single army, up to a limit, I think, of 250 in the original game. But that's quite the advanced part of it. So our first sector, I think, gets spawned at this X position, which is by default 0. So the first actor gets spawned on 0, 0. So first sector, sorry. So this one can just be spawned on 0, 0 as well. And the owner in this case is going to be the player controller. And see how that goes. So some of them are moving in the wrong direction and coming closer to the screen, and that's why they get bigger and smaller. So rather than going up and down the screen, they're going in and out of the screen. But they did spawn, and they are moving around. They're not great, but I don't think we really left them in a particularly great position when I stopped working on them. It's nice to see them running around. Now, this army is just been randomly spawned. We don't know where that army is in terms of its sector, but we do know because it was spawned from the widget that has a sector. Yeah, so we actually spawn. So we spawn this on a sector, don't we? So this should now be an array of army blueprints. And we do want it replicated because we want to display the army blueprint on the different on the minimap later on, and obviously on other people's clients. Let's have a look what that looks like in multiplayer. So create 2 sectors, and we'll just possess them until both players possess them. And player 1 will spawn an army. Okay, so there's at the moment the army doesn't even appear on the other side, but that's probably because I created the army and I never said that it was replicating. So we do want to replicate the army, and it's always relevant to everybody. What's in it is also relevant to everybody. There will be various properties like its strength maybe, or anything else that it has that may not be relevant to everybody, but the actual visual aspect of how many people are in it and what the composition is public information effectively. So let's see if that makes a difference. So one problem with the randomness is that it takes a bit of a time to get everything set up. Okay, so now we have the actors. They're moving differently for different players. I'm not sure that that's a problem. Once they've got the right bounds and they're moving around within the confines of a sector rather than willy-nilly as they are, it doesn't matter if two people see two armies in different places. Because what matters is the composition of that army and not where the individual people are. Again, because of the primitive, I guess, nature of this RTS, the units themselves don't actually fight. It's all just down to the effective strength of each army, and then killing off people based on reducing that strength. At least that's how I understand it. I haven't delved into the combat part yet, so I don't know for certain how the original game implements the combat, but it's certainly not down to a individual army person fires a weapon, and if that weapon hits someone they die, because the weapons within the original game, they just fire randomly in straight lines. So that's clearly not going to be the case. So yeah, little people walk around. Eventually they'll walk so far away that we won't be able to see any of them. There's one just there, just walking off into the distance. But we can obviously spawn another army. Let's see if we can spawn one on this side. Okay, that's not quite what I expected, because it's spawning it on the wrong sector. So one thing that we haven't got in place is obviously any kind of differentiation in player colours. Perhaps something that we look at next stream would be getting their little castle flag on the sectors, and from that the actual white army. So it looks like this is being executed on the server, and the server is actually going to execute it on players 0. I think then if we do a dedicated server, dedicated server doesn't work because my keyboard controls don't actually spawn stuff on the dedicated server scenario, because they're tied up to the level, and while this is all just take a keyboard input, this actually comes from the player, or the player controller, and because we do the switch has authority, it comes from the player controller that has authority, which in a dedicated server neither does. So I think one thing that I'm going to have to sort out is either initialize with stuff, which kind of brings back to where we were with the previous kind of level implementation, rather than just kind of this spawn on demand scenario. That's viable, or I need to better tie up the keyboard keys so they would work even on dedicated servers, which again is possible too. But I'd need to know who pressed them so that the appropriate thing can be spawned in the right place. And I think maybe rather than just randomly spawning buildings on a random sector, I should spawn it based on if I can tie the keys to the players and then get the keys to work on the server, spawn things correctly in that way, then I can make sure that the castle will spawn on the sector the player is possessing. The issue is spending a little bit too much time on making the ad hoc create things bit work, when obviously that's not going to be part of the actual game, but maybe just for kind of testing purposes it might pay off to get that working more solidly and more within the bounds of the game, because obviously having 5 or 6 castles on a sector is not going to work. So that's it for tonight. Made some progress, did find another issue with the possession and the ownership and viewing of the sectors. So that's something that I'm going to try and investigate and see what I can do. It seems really convenient to tie the camera to the sector, but again, if you've got to possess this sector to own that camera, then that's never going to work. So I'm going to try and see if there's a way to fix that. Maybe the player can activate that camera without possessing the sector. That would be something that would be good. But yeah, so that's it for tonight. Should be back. Say, I don't know. Hopefully sometime over the weekend, kind of afternoon time, I might be able to get some time, or maybe Sunday daytime actually. Yeah, maybe Sunday daytime. All else fails, Monday would definitely be stream day, so I'll be back on Monday, if not before. So thanks for watching. If you haven't already followed or subscribed, or depending on the format in which you're watching this, be it YouTube or Twitch, then feel free to, and see you again soon. Bye for now.